IES panelists typically receive an email or a request to serve on a panel with the wonderful bonus of 20-odd proposals to read at home in their leisure, score, and then arrive at DC to meet in a very large group, probably 15, 20 people on a panel. There are a number of panels going on at any given conference hall at a time, and they have triaged their reporting or scoring to be some that are going to panel and some that are not. And so what you're going to see today is the discussion from some proposals and a faux mock review of what that panel might look like. And so you have some of those insights, because I think it can be fairly compelling to see how what it looks like behind the curtain. We're going to have 45 minutes, an hour or so to do this mock review, which is more time than what you would normally spend on two proposals, probably 10 minutes apiece. So we're going to give them 20 or 30 minutes if they want to continue talking about it, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions so you can learn for them personally. Just as a last comment, if you are a part of the College of Education and Human Development, remember that this is one of those events that if you are inclined to visit a program officer in Washington, D.C., please shoot me an email afterwards to make sure we can set you up with helping you to secure funding to do that as well. So
those flyers are on both tables.
All right, and I will let the panelists introduce themselves. We have esteemed colleagues from University of Texas joining us, also a little bit about their research area or whatever they would choose to share. So we'll just go down the row, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jeff. So my name is Liz Gershoff. I'm from UT Austin. I'm in Human Development and Family Sciences. I've served on, I think, 7 years of IES panels, which means it's about 14 or 15 panels I've been on. I've chaired it twice, and I'm going to chair today's based on that experience. Although I've never gotten an IES grant, I have gotten lots of NIH, CDC, and NSF grants. So I know that part of the world. My research is on parenting and interventions to help children and families.
So I'm Jeffrey Liu. I'm a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology here at Texas A&M. So my research background is on children's and adolescents' emotion and self-regulation, and also looking at parenting and educational environmental influences on children's development of emotion regulation and how those processes impact children's learning and achievement outcomes. So my experiences with grant review panels primarily focuses on NSF and NIH. I've been serving on a grant review panel for NIH for the last 2 years. And I'm also currently serving on a standing grant review panel for Hong Kong. So their version of IES, NSF, NIH all kind of rolled into one. So I have not had IES funding myself, and I have not reviewed for IES per se, but I believe my experiences reviewing for other agencies really cuts across multiple agencies, because good grant writing skills really transfer across multiple agencies. But each agency is unique in what they look for, so I'm sure you'll see a lot of those unique features come through this in this mock review panel.
I'm Jay Gans, and I'm a professor of special education, also in educational psychology here. My research is primarily related to interventions for communication deficits, particularly for children or individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And let's see, grant stuff. I've served on IES panels for a whole bunch of years, and I've written a whole bunch of IES proposals over many years, and finally got funded on one within the last year or so, along with Dr. Vanest, where'd she go, and a colleague at UT and one in Minnesota also. So that's that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Esther Calzada. I'm from UT Austin School of Social Work. I have received a Goal 1 IES grant and been involved as a co-I on a Goal 2 and a Goal 3, for those of you who are familiar with IES structure. I've also been funded by NIH and NSF. My research is on early childhood development in Latinx families with a focus on understanding how culture informs family processes and how we can weave those cultural processes into our evidence-based interventions for families.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kay Wijakuma. I'm a Houston Endowed Chair in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Culture here at Texas A&M University. And I'm very happy to see all of your interest in research grant writing. I have been very successful with IES grant funding. I have received over 12 grants as PI, totaling over $70 million. And I have been co-PI with others on 6 other grants, all funded through IES. I have served on the review panel at IES. I have served on the review panel for NSF and NIH and the Hong Kong Grants Council. So I also serve on the European Literacy Networks Grant Council as well. So I hope you enjoy the session today.
Hello, I'm Jamelia Blake. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology. I serve as a panel member for IES. I've been funded by the National Institute of Justice as well as OJJDP. Like Jenny, I've had my challenges with getting a grant submitted or funded by IES, and that hasn't happened yet, but I am a standing panel member and have been funded from other agencies.
All right. So now we're going to go into mode and not talk directly to you all, although we might break the wall at some point, but we're going to try to pretend like you all are not there. And so write down, I'll try to say some things that will make the process make sense to you. But if you have questions, try to write them down and ask them at the Q&A. But we'll try to explain to each other when we feel like it's necessary. So I'm going to be the chair today. Thank you all for participating in this. We're going to review 2 proposals, one Goal 1 and one Goal 3, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. Typically, I ask if anyone's a new IES reviewer, and we have one. So that would mean I would explain it a little bit more. What we'll do for each proposal is I will announce the proposal, and then we'll put up on the board there what the scores are, the first round of scores. And Sue's going to be our helper to put the scores up there. And then I will ask the first reviewer to give a summary of the proposal, and then to explain their scores. And then we'll go through each of the reviewers on the proposal, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. And then after the discussion, I'll ask the reviewers to revisit their scores and change them if they would like. And we'll try to keep each one to around 20 minutes, I think would be good. And so remind everybody, we have 2 different types of scores at IES. We have 4 categories, which we call criterion scores. Those are on a score from 1 to 7, which 7 being good for significance, research plan, personnel, and resources. And then for the overall score, IES likes to mix it up and switch it around so that 1 becomes a good score. And then it only goes to 5. So I do not know why IES does that.
Oh, so it's underlying the high.
Yeah, I underlined the good score for each of those. So we'll put those up there. One thing that they always tell us, which I find very odd at IES, because the other agencies don't do this, but they say this in the breakfast meeting on the first day, is that the funding line is typically a 2 for an overall score. So that's something that gets talked about in the review, which does not happen on any other granting agency, but at IES it does. So we'll try not to talk about funding lines. We are not supposed to talk about funding. We can talk about budget a little bit if there's something kind of egregious that's missing or they're asking for a lot for something, but really the budget is not part of our purview. Okay, so we're going to talk about a Goal 1 proposal, which is an exploration proposal. We don't have any Goal 2 proposals, which are development of and innovation of interventions. We do have a Goal 3, which is an efficacy and replication. We do not have any Goal 4s, which are effectiveness, or Goal 5s, which are measurement. So we'll do a Goal 1 and a Goal 3. Any questions before we start from the panel?
Can you explain a little bit what a goal 1 is?
Sure, yeah. So I can read the goal 1 before we start. Actually, why don't we? Well, I guess I can go ahead and start. So, so our first proposal is going to be a goal 1. So let me explain what that is. Goal 1, exploration goal, supports projects that will identify malleable factors that are associated with student outcomes and/or the factors and conditions that mediate or moderate those relationships. So that's kind of the overall for the goal. It tends to be exploratory research, descriptive research, non-intervention, typically. Okay, so our first proposal, I don't know, should we call this Dr. Smith?
Sure.
This will be Dr. Smith. And so we're going to put up our first round of scores. So our first reviewer, Jenny, do you want to say what your...
I gave it a 2 for significance, 3 for the research plan, 3 for personnel, and 5 for resources. And overall, I gave it a 3.5.
Okay. All right, Esther, you're going to be reviewer 2?
Yep. I gave it a 2 for significance, a 5 for research plan, a 5 for personnel, a 5 for resources, and a 4 overall.
Okay, so we have a little bit of disagreement, but the overalls are looking pretty close, so that's going to be good. Okay, so Jenny, can you start us off with a summary of the project, and then you can go into an explanation of your scores and your strengths and weaknesses.
Sure. Realized I forgot to talk into the mic. Okay, so as you said, this is a goal 1, an exploration proposal for special ed research. And the topic of social and behavioral outcomes. The purpose of the project is to meta-analyze self-monitoring interventions and conduct moderator analyses. And as you can see by my scores, I'm not all that enthusiastic about this proposal. The significance section, I thought would benefit from a stronger statement of the problem. As written, it suggests that self-monitoring has already been determined to be effective, so it's not clear to me that there's a need to evaluate this further. The applicant suggested that this investigation would allow for determination of particular components of self-monitoring interventions that are more or less effective. So that's one thing that they said would be a benefit. The theoretical framework I thought was pretty well articulated. It's unclear to me that the meta-analysis tools that they're considering are the state of the science in the field. The field doesn't seem to have consensus on what to use. This is a single case experimental design meta-analysis, and it's still kind of up in the air to some degree. The applicant, to me, it's just unclear why what the volume of work is needed for this that would require 2 years and $600,000. As far as the research plan, I felt that more details were needed regarding the steps of conducting the meta-analysis. They suggested only non-parametric effect size measures, and this is an area I do a lot of work in, so I kind of know what I'm talking about. That'd be that person. And given this lack of consensus in the field, they would be better off looking at both parametric and non-parametric statistics and then updating this a bit. As well as including maybe a robust visual analysis process, because we have to, of course, appease the visual analysts in single case who don't particularly like us using effect sizes. There is a good deal of detail provided in the analysis. They seem to be pretty well experienced with that part of the process, but less detail in the rest of like the search and that kind of thing. They could use more detail regarding how they determined the likely sample size. That was pretty underdeveloped, and more detail about how they're going to extract raw data from those primary sources. Regarding personnel, the PIs have minimal experience conducting meta-analysis. In addition of a key personnel with parametric statistics, expertise in parametric statistics for effect sizes for single case would be helpful. Including a doctoral student as one of the key personnel was a bad choice, I thought. The resources, this is an institution with very high research activity, so presumably they have the appropriate computing and web conferencing resources, but they didn't really articulate that very well. So, sorry.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Esther, what would you like to add?
Sure. Well, I defer to Jenny on any of the methodological or analytical concerns. I don't do meta-analyses, and it looked pretty well thought out to me, but I definitely defer to you on that. My primary problem with this application was the lack of connection to any educational issue or problem. And so I think there were a lot of assumptions made on the part of the applicants about self-management interventions and the implications of those for improving learning and academic outcomes, and that wasn't articulated in any way. In fact, they really could have unpacked what the problem is, how behavior problems actually map onto learning problems, what interventions are typically used in the classroom, and how what they call SM interventions fits into that broader landscape of school-based interventions. They provide some rationales for this being appealing in terms of kind of being more maybe feasible and appealing to schools, because it's really on the individual student to develop this set of skills and be able to use it across time, problems, and settings, as they say. But there really isn't the landscape around how this is an education issue and how this work is going to address that education issue. I felt like this was really an application for, like a methods study, and it really wasn't appealing to me as somebody who's really focused on behavior problems and social-emotional learning in the classroom. So that was my primary concern. It was a significance concern. In terms of personnel, there's really little detail for us to be able to judge who the investigative team actually is. There seemed to be some relevant expertise, but they kind of slapped on, or it seemed like they slapped on, this methodological consultant that it wasn't even stated what that person was going to be doing, and so it wasn't clear why they were on there. The doctoral student is put on at a very high percentage, high effort, and it's not clear if that student has the expertise to be able to carry the load of really basically conducting this study. I guess I'll add that I know IES is really invested in the implications of the findings and dissemination of findings to educators, and there was no consideration probably related to kind of the problems I articulated around significance. There was no discussion about how this would actually improve educational practices and how that information could be shared with educators. So
Okay,
I'll stop there.
Thanks, Esther. Okay, so let's open it up to the rest of the panel. Other comments from other reviewers? Jeff?
So one of my concerns also, I think I want to echo what Esther, reviewer 2, said. I wasn't clear on how this meta-analysis actually will address one of in the proposal they kept mentioning there was a lack of consensus in the field about how to define self-monitoring or self-regulation, and I wasn't sure how actually doing the meta-analysis would address that lack of consensus in the field. So I wasn't sure, even if successful, how this project would actually meet one of those aims of the project.
I agree with all the comments that have been stated thus far. I think the two areas that are concerned for me is what is the intention? This feels like scope creep. It really feels like it's not really clear if they're asking a substantive question in terms of how do we know if this intervention works in its active ingredients, or are we trying to establish the criteria for doing single case research design and meta-analysis, and with the field seeming not as solidified in the appropriate methods to do single case research design, at least at the way this is presented. It's not my expertise. I have concern that they will be able to accomplish what they intend to, which, so I think there's some confusion about the purpose of the proposal. I think another concern that I have is related to the personnel. So I felt a little bit differently. I think there were definitely some indications that at least the PI and the co-PI were well-trained and had the expertise to carry it out. My concern is their percent of effort devoted to the completion of the project. That's a little bit tricky with it being a meta-analysis because you're not required to collect data. And so IES gives you a smaller budget to do that. But the PI's FTE was 0.10 and another one was 0.05. And then the bulk of the FTE was devoted to this doctoral student, which is problematic in itself because the doctoral student can't work really independently, right? And engaging in this task, and they didn't allocate for enough FTE to even supervise that individual. So I have concerns about the personnel actually, even if we were to move forward and being able to carry out what they intend to because of lack of effort. Or time, excuse me.
And that, when I was reading this proposal, I had a question that I would actually ask IES staff, who normally would be sitting around the room, if you can even have a grad student as a co-PI, because I actually am not sure.
I don't think you can.
NIH, you can't, and so I'm not familiar with the IES procedure.
Yeah.
So I'm actually not sure if that's even possible.
I think usually, I'm sorry, Kay, go ahead. I think usually you can hire graduate students as staff or
Sure.
as project personnel, but being a co-PI is, I've not seen that often.
Yeah.
Add something, Kay.
Oh, I think they said something about the student would be graduating within the next year before it was funded, and it would be more
Oh, so
like a
they're just
postdoc
assuming they'll
position or
be-
something like that. But yeah, still.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big, wow.
For me, that's still a red flag in terms of because this person still hasn't completed. And I think what's challenging is there was limited information in terms of CVs, right? In terms of what, I know.
Yes.
We didn't get
Application
that.
was
I feel like I should just, but anyway, looking at CVs to determine the potential, right, of this doctoral student to carry out the work. I'm sorry, Kay.
So I have a slightly different take on this in that usually in a goal 1, I expect to see that there is some continuation and a possibility of taking this into a goal 2. So my expectation would have been that there would be some additional data collection by the team in order to establish some of these variables or constructs that they've identified through the meta-analysis. Because as it stands, it just seems like they're seeking funding to do a meta-analysis, which by itself I don't think is worthy of an IES grant proposal. So,
Jamelia, do you have a comment on that?
I do because, Kay, I'd like to remind you that I don't know if the criteria actually says for a goal 1, which allows for meta-analysis, that you have to collect original data with the intention of going to a goal 2. Sometimes exploratory projects are just that because you're charting a new area of research that sets the foundation for future research. So I do hear what you're saying, but I just want to remind the panel that I'm not sure that is a criteria.
I can list what the instructions are. Well, the description of a Goal 1 proposal does say that a variety of approaches are appropriate for this work, including but not limited to, and one of the bullets is meta-analyses that go beyond simple identification of the mean effect of interventions. So I think as long as they're doing moderation and contextual differences, that would qualify that.
There are people in this room who have goal 1s for doing just a meta-analysis. They have it. Yeah, some of us. But it's less money and it's less time. So it's just 2 years. If you're collecting original data, I think you can ask for more money in 4 years. So since they were only asking for 2 years, that wasn't a concern for me.
But it's not a criteria. I think just getting back to
it doesn't automatically.
It does relate to the point of to what end? What are the implications of these findings?
That's
Why
valid.
should IES invest in?
I think that's fair.
findings?
But I think the implications can be that it sets the state. I mean, so this is where, can I break for a second? Or-
Okay, yeah, you can break the wall.
So I think the reason we're doing this is because when you're having this panel discussion and there's usually a staff person here, they will remind you of what the goals are because sometimes people break and they start to extend and project. And so so sometimes a portion of the meeting is just kind of getting back to like what are we supposed to be evaluating?
RFA?
Yeah, exactly. So that was my point for raising
no, that's
that.
good. Okay. Other questions from, or concerns or strengths from the panel?
Strengths.
I can just say from my read of the proposal, it was confusing to me what was actually being planned and what the dependent variable was. I wasn't really clear what the dependent variable was until pretty far into the proposal, that it was behavior problems actually. And it wasn't until page 14 that I found out the population.
Yes.
That was ages 3 to 21. That's pretty far into the proposal to find out the ages of the people being studied.
Yeah.
And I also, there wasn't a lot of clarity about the 11 components that they talked about. They say that there's 4 accepted in the field, but they're going to do 11. Where did those 11 come from? What justification do we have for them? So that part was just, so the rationale for the study wasn't as clear to me because of those kind of concerns. And honestly, I'm not familiar with self-management and even with the single case designs, and so I even just wanted definitions of those early on, just to make sure we're on the same page.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that wasn't there in the significance part of the proposal.
To your point, Liz, can I add that these applications that don't define their acronyms when they first use them and their terms, that make assumptions about what we know, it can be really hard to follow. And I think that some of the confusion was that things weren't laid out really clearly up front, including acronyms.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I think there was assumption that the panelists would all know what those things meant.
Yeah.
Yes.
They don't always know what those things mean. Even while
Often
meeting.
do not.
Yeah. Had to do a lot of Googling.
And I think going back to the comments that came across about to what end, the way the research questions are framed, there's a broad spectrum of elements that they're looking at. Students who are primary versus secondary school age, gender, emotional behavioral targets. So there's all these complete variations. So if you take a 8-year-old and a 23-year-old, they're going to be completely different types of things. And you add to it the fact that you're doing single case design. And I'm not an expert on single case design, but it still complicates life on what kind of information you can take forward based on this meta-analysis.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember if there was any kind of mention of sample size of the range of sample size of the
I think
study.
there was.
Something
There is a mention of sample size.
But barely.
Yeah, it's like 5 studies.
Yeah, it was like a few sentences on how.
Yeah.
Is that in the data
No
analysis
description. Sorry, no description.
Okay.
I think that is in the data analysis section. I think it's on page 9. I think point 4. So sample size requirements for the analysis of components and moderating variables. It's not very clearly.
Well, that's for the
written.
meta-analysis, but I was thinking like actually the samples of the studies themselves.
Oh yes, that's in here too. That
is
is.
that in here too?
I remember reading it because
Just to get a sense of how big these studies are that they're talking about.
So it's like it's.
I know I must have read it, but
No, it is. I read it and I was like, interesting.
Yeah, the last of the 3 sentences or so
What page are you
Where
on?
are you?
on
Oh,
17.
sample. Yeah. There's a section.
Preliminary review yielded a subject pool of 3 to 4 students per study for an estimated 450 to 600
Yes.
participants. But yeah, my problem with this was it's 3 sentences. I don't really, where are they getting these numbers from? Lead us to anticipate 150 to 200 studies will be included. Where are they getting it?
They did a preliminary search of abstracts, and so they've done a preliminary lit review to kind of see what comes up, and then somewhere, and maybe this is one of the challenges, is the organization of the proposal. So it's hard to kind of keep track, but somewhere they talked about what the search terms they would use and kind of the index terms, and so whereas they didn't go into a lot of detail about that, but they did say that they reviewed abstracts, and that's what came up.
that's how they got those numbers.
That's how they got those numbers.
But there's just no detail. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to beat the dead horse, but There's just no detail on how are they doing it. I couldn't tell you.
Okay, so yeah, we know how Jenny feels about this
They
one.
just search it.
They just
Do you mean
There are
that you want?
procedures,
Do
you
you
know.
mean that you want like what kind of databases that they're using?
Like the whole thing, yeah, spelled
Like,
out.
for
Where
that
did they?
preliminary information?
Yeah, what were their search terms?
Search terms would be good.
You know.
Dr. Yes, is that standard practice for preliminary stages of meta-analysis?
I would
think it
expect
speaks to
more
the
than this.
organization of the,
Yeah,
of
I
the
think search
application.
terms is pretty straightforward. Because there's usually
I think
very
they were
many.
in
But there
here.
is that
There-
in there.
are
It's
For
just
their
not-
preliminary
It's just not for their
search.
preliminary search.
Okay.
So that's my
talking over
point.
each
Like,
Okay. All right, so yeah, and we have to be careful not to talk over each other so we can all hear each other's lovely points.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, any other strengths or weaknesses before we revisit the scores?
Well, I think the bottom line is, I think Esther mentioned it earlier, the significance of the study is not really evident. And in fact, in the proposal, under the section they title Importance of Funding the Research, they say that the study has potential to impact the field of education, but doesn't really go beyond that very vague and general statement. And that to me is not convincing at all for why this work should be funded and why it's important. So I think that says a
Dampened your
lot.
enthusiasm?
That says a lot for the proposal.
Okay, so Jeff was not convinced. All right, so let's revisit our scores. Reviewer 1, do you want to change any of your scores based on our discussion?
I don't think I can go much further lower on the personnel. I guess overall, I'm going to go to a 4.0.
Okay. All right, reviewer 2, Esther?
So I will, in light
Speaking to the mic, sorry.
of Jenny's comments, I'm going to go down in research plan to a 4, but I'm going to leave everything else the same.
Okay. Okay, so at this point, we all get our laptops open and we go enter our own scores. So at this point, I will break the wall. The rest of the reviewers get to review the proposal however they want. And so they just kind of, everybody just, I think a lot of people just use these as their scores, but people can enter whatever they want.
And they can go outside the range, which is not true in every
Which is not true at NIH. At NIH, you have to review within that range, which there is no range. Everybody would have to put in a 4 for the overall score.
But if you go outside and
Oh, you have to raise your hand.
justify,
That's true.
justify why.
Yeah, you have to raise your hand and say why you're going outside the range, and hopefully you've raised that concern already, so it's not a new thing, because that should happen right at the very end. But at IES, you can go outside the range of those scores and not have to say why. So we enter our scores, and then that's it. Okay,